Thank you, Sam, Trevor, and Fossil for that rocking start to this morning. Ladies and gentlemen, please settle in. A pleasure to welcome you to the 11th General K.S. Thimayya Memorial Lecture. We have quite a lineup for you today. But before we begin, may I request you all to please stand for the rendition of the first verse of the school song. Friends, as we celebrate 50 years of the 1965 war, we remember our officers and Jawans with affection. General Thimayya no doubt had retired by then, but his legacy, his hidden hand, his work rate and his work ethic, I have no doubt, still guided the Indian Army to its successes. Do remember that he had also warned against an adventurous China, which advice was disregarded by the government to its peril in 1962. In his book, Great Game East, Bertil Lintner talks of General Thimayya's new role of being the brainchild behind having mountaineers gather intelligence for India on China's preparation of a highway through Aksai Chin. So that was the sort of dynamic thinker that General Thimayya was. General Thimayya moved seamlessly from being the first Indian Brigade commander during the British regime to being the chief of the army staff in independent India. Along the way, he earned a Distinguished Service Order, a Padma Bhushan, and more importantly, incredible love and loyalty from his troops. His gallantry has been the subject matter of biographies and case studies. His humor and humanness is still talked about at regimental get-togethers. In his order of the day as GOC of 19th Div to the first Sikh at Srinagar, when the battalion left the valley after the 1948 operations, Major General Thimayya, as he then was, spoke of, and I quote, "A great privilege to have you in my division, in which you have helped to lay the foundations of a great tradition, and it is with a great sorrow that I bid farewell to you officers and men whom I have come to love and admire." And he goes on to say, "The Valley of Kashmir will always sing your praises and echo to the deeds of gallantry performed by you. Some of you who are present in the parade have lost all you owned in the West Punjab. You have had your homes uprooted and your families displaced, and many of you are still without a home. In spite of all this, you have fought hard and kept your morale high and enhanced the reputation of the Indian Army. I hope you will all in a very short time be able to take your well-earned leave and that you will find your families in great cheer and happiness, and I wish you all a well-earned rest, and may God be with you," unquote. The sort of sentiment that only an officer who genuinely felt a paternal love and empathy for his soldiers would make. Clearly a soldier's general, Timmy stands tall in the Hall of Fame of generals across the world and Indians at large. So why is it that we come together to celebrate these lectures, this life through these lectures? Was it only because he was our senior at school? No, not just that. It's a lot more than that. I think we do this because we believe that General Thimayya stood for what was the ethic of being Cottonian, that is martial, honorable, and human, an ideal that many of us strive to achieve with very limited success. But to Timmy, these attributes appear to have come quite naturally. And we celebrate this legacy of General Thimayya by inviting distinguished old boys of Bishop Cotton to pay tribute through their lives and through their bodies of work. As you're aware, friends, we've already had 10 such lectures where 10 outstanding old boys of Bishop Cotton have showcased their work and achievement in tribute to the life of General Thimayya, and I believe in doing so, paid tribute to the spirit of being Cottonian. You did see some glimpses of those lectures on the photographs that were scrolled at the start this morning. And in doing so, at the General's Old School, I believe we make a more direct connection. After all, this is the campus that General Thimayya grew up in. This is the campus he saluted when his entourage passed the main gate, even when he was the commander-in-chief of the Indian Army. And it was here, as a boarder, that he broke out from the boarding to sneak away to the neighboring Bangalore club for a little bit of fun and frolic. I'm sure the General would be quite upset with the dry situation prevailing at Bangalore Club these days. Friends, our special thanks are due to the principal, Professor John Zachariah, for making this possible. I can tell you his support has been unstinted. He is unfortunately away for an emergency meeting of the All India Anglo-Indian Schools Association and naturally therefore could not be with us, but his support is undoubted. We recognize the presence of the Vice Principal, Mr. Thambi Dore. Thank you for being here, sir. And we also recognize the presence of a former principal, Dr. Ebenezer. We take this opportunity not only to thank the school, but also the family of General Thimayya, General and Mrs. Chengappa, Belyappa and Nicole, and Amrita for their continued support. My friend Belyappa is representing the family here today. Friends, to add to the spirit of tribute, in 2011, we instituted the General K.S. Thimayya Medal to recognize exemplary service to public life by an old Cottonian. We've had winners from the Indian Army, from the Indian Navy, from the Indian Police Service, and from the Indian Foreign Service so far. This year we move away from traditional public service and award the medal to someone who served public interest in a very different way. It's a proud privilege to announce our medal winner for 2015. Please take a look. Mr. Manohar Chatlani, or Manu to his friends, founded the Have a Heart Foundation that sponsors over 100 heart surgeries every month for the poor and needy. 100% of all donations go directly to charity, with all the overheads taken care by him. Till date, the foundation has supported more than 7,000 such heart surgeries with a sponsorship of over 22 crores in the last 9 years. He is also actively involved in sponsoring spine surgeries for the poor, acute kidney failure for children, vascular surgeries for the destitute who have little hope elsewhere. He sponsors the education of over 500 children so that they have a brighter and a better tomorrow. Interestingly, Mr. Chatlani is the man behind the revolution of the ethnic fast fashion category in the organized retail market of India. He founded Soch, which many of you must know of, and a very well-loved women's ethnic wear brand in the country. But he's shown that business is not just about profiteering, but it is, well, about having a heart. Manu, if I may call you that, sir, we're proud, is a Cottonian. He is from the batch of 1967 and went to Pakenham Walsh House. The milk of human kindness, it seems, runs strong in the 67ers, what with classmate Philip Wallen, institutionalizing it to great effect, as he showed us during the 4th General Thimayya Memorial Lecture. I must apologize to Mr. Chatlani for a minor spelling mistake in his name in the invitation. I take the entire blame for that, sir. You also have the liberty to sentence me to 4 rounds around the first 11s. Hopefully not immediately after the lecture, though. Ladies and gentlemen, to receive the General Thimayya Medal for 2015, it's a great pleasure for me to invite on stage Mr. Manohar Chatlani. And to do the honors, could I invite our patron, Lieutenant Jaitley, to please come on stage. Thank you, General.
At the outset, I would like to thank Aditya Sondi and the Old Cottonian Association for this award. When I was informed that I was being considered for the award, I hesitated to accept it. This was because I first looked at it as being an honor being bestowed on me for something that was never motivated by a thirst for recognition. A large part of my apprehension was also due to the fact that I am by no means solely responsible for the lives that have been saved by the foundation. There are numerous individuals that have given their time and money to make this possible, and I would like to take this chance to thank all these people. They are as deserving of this award as I am. In the end, however, I chose to accept this award because it recognizes the spirit of charity and allows me to share a little bit about how joyous giving can truly be. One way in which I look at charity is that it helps people to live up to their potential. Success is not something that anyone achieves without help in some form along their journey. For me, it was a teacher at this very school who opened my eyes to my potential. I was an average student in the 6th standard when Mrs. Menezes became my class teacher. During the first few weeks of class, there were several instances when I answered her questions correctly. At the end of one of these periods, Mrs. Menezes asked me to stay back after class. She told me she had observed me in class and looked at my old report cards. And at this point, she told me she didn't understand why I consistently came around 20th in class. She told me I should be coming first. She actually sat me down and talked to me about my potential, something that no one had ever done for me before. In the next exam, I came 3rd in class. By planting that seed of self-belief in me, Mrs. Menezes set me on a path to success and changed my life forever. I will be always indebted to her for this. The important thing to learn from this example is that we can help people and potentially change their lives in numerous ways. We at Have a Heart chose to focus on healthcare for the less fortunate. In particular, we provide life-saving heart surgeries for those who can't afford them. Till date, Have a Heart, along with its affiliates in other cities, has made over 7,800 of these surgeries possible. On an average, an open heart surgery in India costs around 2 lakhs. Through tie-ups with noble doctors and hospitals, we have managed to get reduced rates for our patients who need these surgeries. At Have a Heart, we interview every single patient that we sponsor. In order to maximize the number of people that we can help with the limited funds, we assess how much the patient's family can afford and pay the rest. On an average, Have a Heart contributes 40,000 rupees to save a precious human life. Put into perspective, the iPhone 6 costs 1.5 times as much as it costs us to save one child. It is difficult for me to think about the joy of giving without thinking about the 8-year-old sister of one of our patients. Her 1-year-old brother was born with a hole in his heart that would prove fatal if he was not operated on. Her heart made that surgery possible, and the boy now has a chance to live a long, healthy life. A few weeks after his surgery, at a session where we were interviewing the next set of patients, this boy's sister and father had come to thank us. The girl had brought some sweets to give us. Her father explained to us that these sweets were paid for by her. She was being given 50 paisa a day for lunch. She had not eaten lunch for 2 weeks so that she could save 7 rupees to buy us sweets. A room full of people running a charitable organization was given a lesson in sacrifice and gratitude through the actions of a loving 8-year-old sister. Mahatma Gandhi once said, "The simplest acts of kindness are by far more powerful than 1,000 heads bowing in prayer." The actions of this little girl truly highlight the power of charity. It is a vehicle that has the capacity to transform anger into love, futility into potential, and despair into hope. It's a true testament to the human spirit, and on behalf of everyone who embraces the promise of a better future, I would like to thank all of you for recognizing the true potential of charity. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chatlani. I think what you said touched a chord with us. We all have a Mrs. or a Miss Menezes in our lives. And for the boys, the message I think is strong and clear that along with your careers, charity is something that is compatible and fulfilling. Friends, this year some of our former speakers have had something to write home about. General Surendranath, our speaker from the last year, earned himself a PVSM on Republic Day before retiring to Pune, which was his last posting. Ambassador Ranganathan, who is here, turned a youthful 80 and continues to get younger by the day. But it is our first speaker, Nandan Nilekani, who brought the house down. My colleague, C.N. Kumar, the indefatigable Mike Watsa, who recently passed away, leaving behind a void that I believe can never be filled, and myself met Nandan to chat with him about the possibility of having a special benevolent fund to be used for former teachers, administrative staff, and support staff who have served the school loyally, born of the very same sentiment that Mr. Chatlani now expressed, remembering a teacher from more than 40 years ago. Friends, I'm delighted to tell you that almost instantly Nandan agreed to donate 50 lakhs to the cause. And he was more than pleased to have this fund operated by the General Thimayya Memorial Trust, where Nandan was in fact invited as the first speaker. This amount that Nandan has given to the trust is now in a special fund known as the General Thimayya Benevolent Fund, and we're very pleased that we are ready to roll it out this very year. Thank you, Nandan, for your very generous gesture. Friends, when the trustees met to discuss the application of the Benevolent Fund, we talked about names such as Ms. Joseph, our beloved teacher from the junior school, and Mrs. Shankar Narayanan, our librarian, and some others, only to find that they had passed us on earlier this year. In that sense, we realized that we had left this effort too late already. We do realize that we have an amazing pool of retired teachers and staff whom we will endeavor to honor to honor in the coming years. But I can tell you it's been no easy task to start this off. However, a start must be made, and we have resolved to begin by awarding a certificate and a check for 1 lakh rupees to 4 retired members of the staff this year. To hand out the first 2 checks, may I please request Ambassador C.V. Ranganathan to come on stage. Many of you will remember him from the second lecture. Kiran, could you please? just in case you missed your morning walk, Rangi. Our first recipient is Dr. Iqbal Ahmed. Dr. Iqbal Ahmed was the Hindi master and first officer of the unbeatable NCC troop for 23 years at Cottons. He served most faithfully between 1976 and 1999 and inspired many a young Cottonian to become a gentleman cadet in whatever was his calling, a PhD in Hindi and an institution by himself. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for Dr. Iqbal Ahmed. Next we have Mr. B.R. Channappa Gowda. Mr. Gowda taught Kannada as a second language to the 6th standards through the 12s for 33 years, from 1971 to 2004. During this time, he also taught Sanskrit as a third language to the middle school, a loyal friend of the school and an unsung hero, Mr. Gowda. Thank you, Rangi. Thank you, Mr. Gowda.
Thank you very much.
To hand out the other two certificates and checks, I'm happy to call on stage our senior trustee, Mr. C.N. Kumar, please. The third recipient in absentia is Mr. J. Martin. Martin joined Cottons in 1968. Oh, is Mr. Martin here? Brilliant, he's here. Is that not typically self-effacing of Martin? With a first row seat with his name on it, he's sitting right at the back. That is Martin that we remember. Ladies and gentlemen, Martin joined Cottons in 1968 as a science lab attender, in which capacity he worked for a full 38 years. He spent the last 2 years of his service as an assistant to his principal, Colonel John Ellis, before retiring in 2008 after 4 decades of loyal service. Many of us remember Martin fondly from the biology lab, especially when he went looking for cockroaches, because that meant cockroaches were going to be on the menu for the practical examination. Thank you very much for being with us, Martin. The last of our recipients, and this is a special one, is Mr. S. Anthony. Now, I only got to know that his name is Anthony very recently because we obviously had to issue some official paperwork. We knew him as Joker, and the older batches knew him as MGR. And MGR, I believe, was a name given to him out of affection by Ramu Ganesan. Now retired to Tiruvannamalai, he served Cottons between 1965 and 1998 for a full 33 years. Anthony was a jack of all trades, keeping the dining hall and the kitchen clean, cooking at times, and keeping the campus and classrooms spotless. He insists that he stood in for the bearers when they were on leave, which again he insists was quite often. Many of us watched in awe as he used to twirl a lit bidi in his mouth. I'm quite sure that was not with the knowledge of the principal. Thank you very much for being here, Joker, MGR, Mr. S. Anthony. Ladies and gentlemen, the four of these gentlemen have served Cottons collectively for a staggering 129 years, which in perspective is just 21 short of its full 150, which we have been celebrating recently. Thank you all, gentlemen, for being with us today, and please receive this certificate and check as a token of our affection and our very deep admiration for what each one of you has done for Cottons, for us, and please also receive it on behalf of the larger teaching community and staff of Bishop Cotton Boys School. We do promise to keep up this effort going forward in the years ahead. And that's where, friends, I want to tell you that Nandan intended to be an anchor to this fund, with the desire, obviously, for other old boys to chip in so that this benevolent fund can grow from strength to strength and we can continue to recognize and celebrate our wonderful teachers. Many of our former teachers, I'm so happy to say, are with us today. So if any of you old boys are keen to support this special benevolent fund, please reach out to any of us trustees and we'll be happy to write to you with the details, including details of our Section 80G exemption and so on. Well, now coming to the lecture, or the lectures, must I say, because we have two speakers this year, both of whom are blue-blooded Cottonians. After 10 years, we've decided to experiment with a new format, to have not one but two speakers, and younger ones at that. We thought this would showcase some of our younger talent on hand and also strike a chord with the younger Cottonians in the audience. Though, of course, when we were your age, anyone who was 2 years older was deemed to be over the hill. But I can assure you, PCs, that these are some of the best role models that you will find. First, Dr. Rahul Rao. Rahul is a senior lecturer in political science at the prestigious School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, and has sharp research interests in international relations, particularly in South Asia, comparative political thought, and gender and sexuality. His book, Third World Protest Between Home and the World, was published with Oxford University Press in 2010. It explored the relationship between cosmopolitanism and nationalism in the setting of post-colonial protest. He is currently working on a book on queer post-colonial temporality. He has been a term fellow in politics at the University College, Oxford University. Rahul, in fact, went to Balliol College, Oxford, as a Rhodes Scholar, where he read for a doctorate in international relations. He played Othello in the Oxford production, which comes as no surprise to many of us who remember him as the Shivaji Ganeshan Cup winner for being the best actor at school. Rahul was a few years junior to me at the National Law School, where I distantly admired him for his industry. It seemed that he effortlessly eased through National Law School, while many of us were still struggling with things like attendance. Rahul then went on to win the Rhodes Scholarship, something he richly deserved for his tremendous all-round talents. Besides theatre, one remembers him from school as a gifted violinist and an elocutionist. In his final year, 1995-96, Rahul was deservedly captain of school despite have been gone to Pettigrew House. But in In fairness to Pettigrew, Rahul is the 5th speaker from Pettigrew House in the General Thimayya series. So it's just a little bit of sour grapes on my part. Mrs. Pratima Rao remembers him from a Teacher's Day address when he asked those of the students who wanted to go on to become teachers in life to raise their hands. I believe not a single hand went up, quite an eloquent way of making a statement. The fact that Rahul himself teaches today should warm the cockles of the hearts of his old teachers who, as I said, are present here. Mrs. Cherian is in fact here specially to see Rahul. We recognize the presence of Rahul's parents, Mr. Ashok Rao and Mrs. Gayatri Rao in the audience, as also his sister Nitya and his grandmother and other family members. Mrs. Gayatri Rao, in fact, is the tour de force behind the Old Girls Association. Rahul, it was a pleasure to catch up with you again at Koshi's yesterday. I don't think we've ever talked that much till last evening. A lawyer, scholar, actor, teacher, musician, marathon runner, ladies and gentlemen, please show your appreciation for Dr. Rahul Rao. Dr. Rohan Narayana Murty. And we did deliberately handpick photographs from school that made both of them look at their nerdiest best. After all, what are seniors for? Rohan is a junior fellow in the Society of Fellows, Harvard University, which is also known as the Harvard of Harvard for its uber competitive selection process. The society selects just 10 PhD scholars worldwide every year. Rohan attended Cornell University as an undergraduate and received his PhD in computer science from Harvard for his thesis on opportunistic wireless network architecture. Cottonians in the room will be pleased to know that his paper was signed off with the school's motto, nec dextrorsum, nec sinistrorsum. Rohan was previously a Computing Innovations Fellow at MIT and is a recipient of the Seibel Scholars Fellowship and Microsoft Research Fellowship. While Rohan's research interests span network systems, embedded computing, and distributed computing systems, his eclectic tastes and keen interest in philosophy, history, and the classics led to the conception of the Murty Classical Library of India, of which he is the founder. The library aims to make available the great literary works of India from the past 2 millennia in accessible translations. The first tranche saw the likes of Bhule Shah, Abul Fazl, Teryagatha, Manu, and Surdas being released in very elegant, and I can tell you personally, very readable translations. This labor of love of Rohan's, I know, is born of his urge to reclaim an Indian identity of literary genius that perhaps got lost somewhere in the overarching, though equally compelling, Western literature that we grew up reading. Rohan is a Cotton's file and at one time wanted to return to school to teach full-time till, I believe, Mrs. Naeem knocked better sense into him. He is from the batch of 2001 and is the first speaker we have had in 11 years from Elphick House. I do sincerely hope he's not the last. Rohan was house captain and not surprisingly was the first computer science captain at Cotton's. His parents, who we recognize and need no introduction, Mr. Narayan Murty and Mrs. Sudha Murty, we welcome them warmly. And I'm sure, Mr. and Mrs. Murty, you will be proud to know that your son is known as so much more than just the son of the Murtys. Though I didn't know Rohan personally in school, you might have been in half pants, as we said. I'm extremely proud to confess, for those of you who don't know this, that the General Thimayya lectures started in 2004 with Rohan as my sole comrade. He quickly moved on from the endeavor to pursue his brilliant academic record, but it is such a wonderful privilege for me today to welcome him as a keynote speaker. He's come full circle in a sense, though it's a while before we can appoint you patron. For the younger OCs, please take this upon yourself as a challenge to break Rohan's record of returning as a Thimayya speaker within just 14 years of graduating from Cottons. Ladies and gentlemen, please convey your warmest welcome to Dr. Rohan Narayana Murty. Before we move on to the speeches, a quick word about the topic, Academia at Crossroads, Finding and Fostering Creativity. Academia is today pursuing a multidisciplinary approach, recognizing the need to find creative spaces to further research and intellectual development, a message that one of our former speakers, Dr. Ajit Varki, so eloquently communicated to us. It is always a challenge to multitask, if you will, staying at the course and also seeking creativity. Our speakers have both done that with elan, and they will talk about the methods by which they have found this creativity, the challenges that they have found to this creativity within and without, personal and structural, and how one can recognize. And to the PCs, this is a message to you that pursuing academics and being creative are both possible and compatible. Just as Mr. Chatlani showed you that charity and business can go together, here is another dynamic combination. The speakers will speak for about 25 to 30 minutes each, after which there will be a short moderated question and answer session where I will interact with both speakers, very briefly asking them maybe a question each, not planted questions, I can assure you. And thereafter, the floor will be open for questions from the audience, strictly on a first-come, first-served basis. We will, of course, prioritize younger students who may have questions for their seniors, and I do hope that you will come forward with a question or two, as your seniors have done previously. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to invite on stage the first speaker, Dr. Rahul Rao.
Thank you, Aditya, for that fantastic introduction, and thank you all for being here today. That was quite a build-up, and I hope I can deliver, especially because the last time I gave a speech in Cottons about 20 years ago was quite a disaster. It was the day of our graduation in 95 or 6, I can't remember which month, so the last year of school. And I was so emotional because I'd been in school for 12 years, actually 14 years if you count 2 years in kindergarten in the other school across the road, that it was a bit like leaving home. And I was so emotional that I just launched straight into the speech without acknowledging the presence of anyone. The customary parents, teachers, friends, all of that went out of the window, and I just started talking. And about midway through the speech, I thought, oh God, I've really blown it, because this is really not what you're supposed to do. And sure enough, when I got off the stage, I was met by this very stern-looking and distinguished old Cottonian who said, you know, that was very good, but it's not how we do things here. I'm supposed to talk about creativity today, and in a way I think being creative is about not doing things the way that they're normally done. So I think I took a lesson out of that experience, which I've tried to hold with me. But having said that, I don't want to be disastrous in the same way today. So I want to begin by thanking again Aditya for that fantastic introduction. I don't think I've ever been introduced in such a way before. This is really like coming back home. So many people in my family for so many generations have been to Cottons that coming back to school is always a bit like a family reunion. It's also great to see many familiar faces. I wasn't sure I'd see people I recognized, partly because I haven't been back often enough. But I did, and I'm really happy to see former teachers and classmates and juniors, in addition to the new people that I will undoubtedly meet in the course of the day. I want to thank the Board of Trustees of the General K.S. Thimayya Trust, who have worked to make this event possible, and everyone else outside of the Board of Trustees who've also put in a lot of effort. I hear that the lectures have become something of an institution, both in the school but in the city at large, and I think that's fantastic. It really seems to have enriched the cultural calendar of the city, which is great. They have, as Aditya said, tried an experiment this year. As any of you who've done an experiment will know, experiments sometimes fail. Hopefully this one won't, and we will vindicate your faith in shuffling the speaking generational order as you go forward. I want to thank the patrons of the trust, the members of the Thimayya family who are here today, the principal, Professor John K. Zachariah, Mr. Tambidurai, who is here with us today, staff and students for giving us this venue and for your presence here as well, and the general public at large, even if you're not associated with Cottons. So the topic for today's lecture was thrashed out in a series of emails and conversations, mostly with Aditya and Rohan and myself. And the topic we were given was Academia at the Crossroads, Finding and Fostering Creativity. And we were asked as speakers to talk about the methods by which we have found ways to be creative. In a way, I think this is a bit vague and very hard to talk about. Creativity is hard to talk about because if there was a formula for it, and if everyone followed that formula, the end product would not be creative at all. So I'm not going to give you a formula here today. I suppose I could talk about how I have personally tried to be creative, and I would be happy to do that in the Q&A. But it also feels a bit self-indulgent to just give an autobiographical story, and almost irresponsible, I think. And I'm using the word irresponsible because I think we are at a crucial juncture as a society at which we really need to be thinking and talking about the wider social conditions within which creativity is possible or not possible, rather than just the strategies that we might pursue as individuals to be creative. So I want to focus more on these wider social conditions within which any kind of creativity must happen. Now, to explain this, I want to draw an analogy from a context that may seem quite distant, but bear with me as I try to explain it. This is an analogy from the life and work of a figure who many of you may be familiar with. This is Frantz Fanon, the great anti-colonial thinker and activist of the Algerian Revolution against French colonial occupation. Fanon was born in Martinique, a small Caribbean island, but spent a lot of his time in France, where he did his medical and psychiatric training, and then later in Algeria. He lived from 1925 to 1961, and he's as significant in the pantheon of anti-colonial activists as Gandhi, but also very different from him in that he made a strong argument for the use of violence against the colonial occupier, which in his case was the French. My interest in Fanon today has less to do with his position on violence and more to do with the way he managed to combine in his life, up to a point, the pursuits of being both a psychiatrist and a political activist. So from 1953 to 57, he worked as a psychiatrist in a hospital in a place called Blida-Joinville in Algeria, while also being a member of the Front de Libération Nationale, which was the main anti-colonial organization in Algeria at the time. Now, I say up to a point, he combined these two pursuits, because he famously resigned from his position in the hospital in 1957, and he wrote in his resignation letter, which you can read on the internet, and I'm just going to quote one sentence from that letter. He said, "If psychiatry is the medical technique that aims to enable man no longer to be a stranger to his environment, I owe it to myself to affirm that the Arab," he's talking about the colonized Algerian, "permanently an alien in his own country, lives in a state of absolute depersonalization." And with that, he leaves the hospital and he goes underground to join the political struggle. Now, in effect, what he was saying was, no matter what I do for my patients in the clinic to help them fit better into society, The society they live in is so dehumanizing that it is a better use of my time to try to change those social conditions than to confine my efforts to the clinic as a doctor. Right? So in the same way, I want to suggest that no matter what I or anyone else says about how to be a creative person or a creative practitioner, the social conditions within which we live are currently, I think, quite hostile to creativity, and I would be failing in my duty if I confine my remarks today to what creative practitioners should do in their art or in their work in a broad sense, without addressing those broader conditions within which creativity can or cannot take place. To use another, maybe more direct example, the great author and literary modernist Virginia Woolf was once asked to give a lecture on women and fiction. And in giving this lecture, which was published as an essay called A Room of One's Own, she says very simply at the beginning, a woman cannot produce fiction unless she has money and a room of her own. Right? So the main point of the lecture was to emphasize the conditions within which creativity was or was not possible. In her case, she was saying how difficult it was to be creative in the early 20th century as a woman in a time when educational institutions in what we would call the developed part of the world were equally hostile to women's equality. So what are these broader conditions that I've been talking about? So far, this event has been very uplifting for me personally because we've been talking about philanthropy, we've been seeing some wonderful examples of things people have done to make society better. For the next 10 minutes, I'm probably going to make you feel less good because I want to run through certain things that are happening, which I think will be very familiar to you, which do worry me about the prospects for creativity. So please bear with me. Hopefully we won't stay in that depressing place for too long, but I do want to run through some of these moments or incidents in the recent past. Now, I think any of you who've been following the news will be familiar with virtually all of these moments that I'm about to talk about. But I want to place them before you again because it's been suggested that these things are aberrations, they are one-off, stray occurrences. And I believe that taken together as a whole, they suggest the emergence of some worrying trends for creativity that we need to take note of. So I would say that there are currently three broad challenges to creativity, which I'll call existential threats, institutional threats, and financial threats. And I'll just run through some examples of each of those. So beginning with what I'm calling existential threats, and I think it'll become evident why I think of them in that way. Example one, in January of this year, the Tamil writer and professor Perumal Murugan announced in his Facebook status, and this is a quote, he said, "Author Perumal Murugan has died. He is no god, so he is not going to resurrect himself, nor does he believe in reincarnation. From now on, Perumal Murugan will survive merely as the teacher he has been." The announcement followed an outcry from certain caste Hindu groups about a book that Murugan had written in 2010. Madhur Bagan is set about 75 years ago near the author's native town in Namakkal district. In the book, this is the main plot of the story, a childless couple from the land-owning Gounder caste contemplate participating in a local temple festival ritual, during which a childless woman has sex with a man other than her husband in order to conceive a child. Local groups protested against the book, saying that the fictitious extramarital sex ritual at the center of the plot insulted the town, the temple, and its women. Copies of the novel were burnt, residents shut down shops, a petition sought the arrest of the author. Murugan, in an interview with BBC Tamil, said, "The novel is not against God or religion. A novel is a work of imagination. When writing a novel, one needs a place, people, and context to relate it to." And the quality of his work is attested to by many literary critics. The Tamil literary critic Theodore Bhaskaran wrote in an article in Frontline about the depth of historical research, the beauty of the language in the novel. Murugan himself believes that the protests had very little to do with the book, and often in these cases the protesters haven't read the book, settling that they were merely settling scores for his anti-caste activities. So this is a case of metaphorical suicide, where the author says, "I can no longer create, I'm not going to create because of threats to my life." So let's move to another example, from metaphorical suicide to what I would call the murder of the book. And here my example is what happened to Wendy Doniger's award-winning book, The Hindus, which is a study of Hinduism that focuses not on the Sanskrit texts that are created and perpetuated by a small upper caste male elite, but instead a study of Hinduism that looks at the rich oral and vernacular traditions that have been kept alive by women and lower caste voices. So in 2011, a case was brought against this book by a group called the Shiksha Bachao Andolan, led by a man called Dinanath Batra, who's now become infamous for protesting against many books. He argued that the book contained heresies insulting to Hinduism. One irony of this charge is that the very idea of a heresy meaning a challenge to established beliefs, the very idea of heresy comes from religious systems with codified beliefs, so from the monotheistic religions like Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. As a concept, it is alien to Hinduism, but here was a Hindu group charging somebody with heresy. In 2014, Penguin, the publishers of the book, reached an out-of-court settlement with the protesters, and they agreed to pulp to destroy all copies of the book. I believe that this, I'm not sure, but this apparently didn't actually happen. What really happened is that a lot of readers like me just went to the nearest bookshop and bought up all the last remaining copies. And I hear there are still ways in which you can get the book. Perhaps the best reaction to this situation came from a legal notice that my friend and senior from National Law School, Lawrence Liang, who worked with the Alternative Law Forum, sent to Penguin, the publishers, and I quote from that legal notice. He said, "While they may both be birds, there is a world of difference between a penguin and a chicken. And the last time my clients checked, the penguin had not changed his feathers in the natural world." The notice also accused the publishers of discriminating between different categories of readers by prioritizing one group of readers who claimed to be offended against the interests of another, possibly much larger group of readers who found the book to be interesting and enlightening and informative. Wendy Doniger, the author herself, in an article in the New York Review of Books said, and this is another quote that I think is directly relevant to our topic about creativity today. She says, "It's hard to imagine how you could write about any subject as sensitive as religion or history without outraging someone. Such a rule would mean the end of creative and original scholarly thought. Any new idea offends people who are committed to the old idea, which is to say most people," right? I'm going to say that again. Any new idea offends people who are committed to the old idea, which is to say most people. Even in the hands of someone as intellectually challenged as Batra, Article 295A, I think she means Section 295A of the Indian Penal Code, is a weapon of mass cultural destruction. What typically happens in scenarios like this is that the publishers blame the government and the law for failing to provide security against the threats of the protesters. The government blames the protesters blame the writers, and the net result of all of this blaming is both a displacement of responsibility onto somebody else and a situation in which, as a society, we can access creativity less and less because it becomes harder and harder to say anything that is genuinely new. Finally, in this category of existential threats, we've seen metaphorical suicide, we've seen the murder of the book. We have also, unfortunately, seen the murder of authors, right? And I'll be very brief here because these are recent incidents that we have all heard of. So on the 30th of August, Professor M.M. Kalburgi was killed at his residence in Dharwad. He's a former Vice Chancellor of Hampi University, author of hundreds of books and articles, and a Sahitya Academy Award winner. So a very prominent literary personality. And he seems to have attracted the ire of some people in the Lingayat community for his exploration of the life of Basavanna. Also murdered very recently, Govind Pansare, a CPI leader who has written a biography of Shivaji that was controversial, and Narendra Dabolkar in August 2013, who was a founder of an organization set up to eradicate superstition. These three authors and activists are often described in the press as rationalists because their life's work was to struggle against superstition, religious and caste-based superstition. And most recently, within the last 10 days, the author Girish Karnad has incurred similar threats for comments he's made about Tipu Sultan, of whom he has a very deep and considerable knowledge, which comes out of his writing of the famous Tippu Veena Kanasugalu, which was translated into English as The Dreams of Tipu Sultan and has been performed in Bangalore many times. So what I've been describing above is a set of these existential threats to creativity where the very life of the creator is under threat. But creativity is also under threat in more subtle ways. Creativity needs institutions like this one in order to flourish. And those institutions need nurturing, they need leadership, funding, autonomy. And here too there are things to worry about. So let's maybe look at leadership and autonomy first. Three, again, very quick recent examples. The Nehru Memorial Museum is one of the premier cultural and academic institutions in this country. Anyone who is a historian of India or in India has had to use the Nehru Memorial Museum. The current government believes that it is too dedicated to the legacy of one person and wants to transform it into a museum of governance. As a result of this and related controversies, its former head, Mahesh Rangarajan, who's one of our ablest and most capable academic administrators, has had to quit his job. At the same time as we are losing people of such stature, other institutions have recently been headed by people whose credentials for those jobs are suspect. So you'll know that there has been a 140-day strike at the Film and Television Institute of India protesting the appointment of Gajendra Chauhan, who's not particularly well known for his acting credentials, as its chairman. Similarly, the Indian Council of Historical Research, which is the premier body administering the discipline of history in this country, has had appointed as its chairman Y.S. Rao, who, according to Romila Thapar, one of our most well-known historians, is not somebody that historians knew very much about. Finally, let me say something about funding threats. And you may also have heard of a major student protest and occupation of the UGC, the University Grants Commission in Delhi, which is the result of the proposed discontinuation of scholarships to MPhil and PhD students for research. Now, these are very meager scholarships of 5,000 and 8,000 rupees per month, which are provided to scholars in certain select institutions. And the withdrawal of even this low level of support to research by the government is, I would say, a major threat to any kind of academic production. This is a government that claims to want to make in India, but it's hard to see how knowledge can be made in India without strong state support for its production. And now I promised the trustees that my talk would not be all doom and gloom. And I think I want to shift register here at this point. Although I should say, and this is something I was reading recently, a quote from the great Palestinian intellectual and activist Edward Said, who's written a wonderful book on the job of being an intellectual. And he says, and this is a quote, "Least of all should an intellectual be there to make his or her audiences feel good. The whole point is to be embarrassing, contrary, even unpleasant, to publicly raise embarrassing questions, to confront orthodoxy and dogma rather than produce them, to be someone who cannot easily be co-opted by governments or corporations, and whose raison d'etre is to represent all those people and issues that are routinely forgotten or swept under the rug." I think that's a great manifesto for what it means to be an intellectual or a thinker or a creative person of any kind. But I don't want to leave you feeling despondent and hopeless and powerless. And so in the time I have left to me, I want to say something about what we might do to deal with these challenges to creativity. I think circumventing threats to creativity itself requires creativity, in part because the old methods of protest may not be enough to deal with the new situations we are confronted with. One of the most inspiring things, in my view, that's happened recently is an initiative by Sahitya Academy Award winners to return their awards. I think at last count, nearly 40 people, artists, writers of different kinds, and also scientists more recently have begun returning their awards in protest against this atmosphere of intolerance, this hostility to creativity. And also, more specifically, in protest at the Sahitya Academy's silence over the murder, over the silencing of one of its own people. So I think this Sahitya Academy Award Winners initiative has reminded us that the role of writers and artists and creative practitioners is not simply one of entertainment, but in a sense to be the conscience keepers of society. I think creative artists are in this moment, in this quite difficult moment, rediscovering and reaffirming their public role in society. Now critics have said, why are they being political? As if being political was a bad thing, right? For me, politics is not a bad thing in and of itself. Politics is simply the art of learning to live together in community. You can have good politics or bad politics, but the idea of having a life in community without politics seems quite strange to me. So the fact that they are being political is not in and of itself a bad thing. I want to finally connect some of these themes up with the sort of education we pursue as teachers and students in a school like this. And to do that, I want us to look more closely at the kinds of subjects with which the figures I have mentioned in my talk are most closely associated. Literature, religion, history, film, right? What we call the arts and humanities. As a society, we have a strangely contradictory attitude towards the humanities. On the one hand, they've historically been given short shrift. They've been underfunded by the state, not just in India, but all over the world. Historically, the greater investment has always been in the hard and the technical sciences because it's believed that these are the disciplines needed for nation building. And as I said, this is not just the case in India. In the UK, where I currently work, the education minister recently said to a group of high school students, you should study what they call there the STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, and maths, because these are the subjects that keep your options open. This is exactly what we were told here. And in Japan, the education minister recently wrote to the 86 national universities in the country, calling on them to take active steps to abolish social sciences and humanities, or to convert them to serve areas that better meet society's needs. 26 of those universities have confirmed that they will either close down or scale back the relevant faculties. So the humanities have historically not been supported very much by the state, which is focused on economic growth, and thinks these subjects are not relevant to that objective. And also by us as individuals in society, because we are rightly focused on studying the things that we think will get us jobs, right? Now, both of these things, economic growth at the national level and finding jobs at an individual level, are important. It's hard to imagine life without being able to do those things. But they cannot exhaust the meaning of life, because if they did, we would just be consumers. We wouldn't be citizens. On the other hand, the humanities are considered dangerous. It is practitioners of the humanities who are under the greatest attack in the examples I've just given. And it's also from these sections of the academy that the fight back against intolerance has begun. These are the politically most controversial subjects. When a government changes, the first textbooks it looks at are the history books, right? You'll never see riots over chemistry books. So there is a contradiction here. The humanities cannot both be useless and dangerous, right? And I would suggest, in fact, that people who say that the humanities are useless are really trying to conceal a kind of anxiety about the ways in which they can be subversive. So my question then is, what are the humanities for? And I think that's a very valid question. We should ask that question. At the broadest level, the humanities are the study of what makes us human. When we study literature, history, art, music, languages, theater, film, even when we look at television and computer games, which many of us play, what are these things doing? They are full of stories that express ideas through which we understand our own humanity. These are subjects that inculcate critical thinking, interrogative skills that help us with pretty much anything, any kind of job, but also specifically help us to hold governments to account and to be an active and engaged citizenry. They are subjects that help us with language and communication, which again is something we need whatever we do, whether our pursuits are in science or business or commerce or anything. I want to just clarify that I'm not trying to propose a hierarchy of subjects. So I'm not saying the humanities are more important than anything else. I am trying to draw attention to a neglected and marginalized area that is often lost in the competitive rush for economic growth and jobs. And if we lost those, we would also lose the skills for being an active citizenry. We would lose the skills for being able to talk about the problems we face at an international level. I want to say two final things, and I've used the word final so many times, but this is really the last two final things I want to say. And these are, I think, much more optimistic things, so they might come as a relief to you. One of them is that I want to commend school. I want to commend Bishop Cottons for giving me and for continuing to give people a humanistic education. Why do I say that? When I was doing ISC in 95 and 96, we didn't actually have humanities subjects. And I was getting all ready to make a speech here that said, why is this the case and so forth. But I had the good sense to look at the website and I see that there are now ISC humanities options. And I think this is wonderful. And I commend whoever took the decision to introduce those subjects into the curriculum. But I did have a humanistic education, despite not having these subjects at ISC level. Certainly we had them up till 10th standard. But there were many things in the curriculum that offered the opportunity for a humanistic education. Aditya in his introduction mentioned drama. Drama is probably one of the most important things I did when I was at Cottons. Anyone who's been an actor on stage or who's read a novel, right, which is most of us, what is it that you're doing when you're engaged in those pursuits? You have to put yourself in the shoes of another character, right? You learn something called empathy. And empathy is the quality that is singularly missing in the incidents of intolerance that I've been mentioning. It is the quality of being able to imagine what life might be like for somebody who is different from you. So drama was very important for me personally. It was actually also important from a career point of view. I would never have been able to give this speech today if not for all those elocution and dramatic sessions and rehearsals and competitions. And every time I speak to a class of students at my university, it's my drama training more than anything else that holds me. In some ways, it's one of the most important things that I did here. The other thing I want to say, and maybe this is a good lead-in to our next speaker, is I want to sort of commend Rohan for some of the initiatives he's done. As you would have gathered from his bio, he's somebody who exemplifies the most wonderful combination of the sciences and the humanities. And I want to specifically mention the Murty Classical Library initiative, which Rohan has been responsible for, which Aditya mentioned in his introduction. Which, as Aditya said, is a series that aims to publish the great works of classical literature produced in India over more than 2 millennia. And Aditya also mentioned the first 5 volumes that have come out in this, I think, Herculean endeavor, which include Abul Fazal's Akbarnama in Persian, Bulle Shah's Sufi lyrics in Punjabi, Surdas's Sursagar in Old Hindi, Allasani Peddana's Story of Manu in Telugu, and Terigata, poems of the first Buddhist women, who may also be the first collection of women's literature in the world. And I just want to quote from a review article about this initiative, which was written by Neil Mukherjee, who was shortlisted for a Booker Prize this year. Neil gives a wonderful overview of this initiative, and he ends the article by saying, at a juncture when state-supported historical blindness and illiteracy have seen historians lose their jobs because of refusing to bow to thuggish mythologizing and lies, the Murty Classical Library of India produces hard evidence for a complex past to counter the falling darkness. And on that note of light, I want to conclude and hand over to my next speaker, and I wish to thank you once again for giving me this opportunity.
Listening to Rahul talk about the last time he spoke at Bishop Cottons, the last time I spoke or did anything on this stage of note was in 2005 when one of the teachers in school then, Mrs. Indrani Sudarshan, very kindly requested me to lead the school during St. Peter's Day prayers,
which meant that I had to kneel down and sing. There used to be a music teacher in school called Mr. George, who never gave me more than a D in singing. And whenever I'd sing, he would say, "Oh, this fellow again," and he would actually leave the room until I was done and then come back in. So I was awfully nervous singing. And by comparison, this seems a lot easier. I'm very grateful and I'm very honored to be invited by Aditya and his colleagues to come speak here. I recognize the long list of speakers who have gone before me, including today, including Rahul, of course, who have all been old Cottonians, who have done wonderful things in life. And in that sense, I feel much younger and perhaps not yet ready, but nonetheless, here I am. So thank you, Aditya, and thank you to the trust of the General Thimayya Memorial Lectures Trust for inviting me. When we were in school, and it's true even today for many of the Cottonians here, our parents are our heroes, but we tend to spend more time in school, and therefore invariably many tangible heroes in school tend to be some of our teachers and some of our seniors. And for me, certainly the sort of exemplar of what it means to be a Cottonian has always been Aditya Sondhi. And and I don't say this because Aditya is very kind and invited me to speak and had this very nice introduction. I've always believed this because I was in my half pants, as Aditya mentioned, when I first remember a Pakenham Walsh House left-handed batsman, playing for school for Cottons against St. Joseph's, and that was Sondhi. I remember Sondhi as the school captain, even though I was much younger. I was probably in the 4th or 5th. But these were people of character. These were men in our eyes, and people that we wanted to grow up to emulate and be like. And Aditya was the first of the long list of these people, and to me, he exemplifies everything of how I always wanted to be a student in school and how I wanted to be an alum of the school. And then, of course, there was Rahul Rao, who had multiple talents and sort of, so many facets to his personality. I was probably in the 6th or the 7th, and I remember him, playing the violin, acting on stage, topping the country in a national exam, and pretty much doing everything, except maybe dance. I don't remember that. And so it's really such a thrill and a privilege and an honor to follow Rahul and to certainly be here amongst many old Cottonians. I'm very grateful to the school, to the principal, to the vice principal, Mr. Tambidurai, who was my maths teacher, for inviting me to come, for hosting all of this. I'm very pleased and happy to see many of my former teachers, Mr. Iqbal Ahmed, who we were all dead scared of in school, at least I was, and who really exemplified to us of what it meant to have discipline. And I think perhaps I realized that many years later after I left school, of Mr. Chennapagowda, who in Kannada would rebuke me repeatedly. "Ninage yenu barala, nim tai nodu, neen nodu." So, of course, he said a few more things which I will not repeat here. But it's very nice to see him again, and of course many more teachers. One of whom in particular I must thank, who I also thank in my PhD dissertation acknowledgements, and that's Mrs. Pratima Rao, who came from Baldwin's and to teach in this school, to teach computer science. My interest in computer science really was born when I was in 5th standard in school, and we had this, at least one of the other sort of seniors that I looked up to was a person named Arun Raghuraman, who's not here in Cottons today, and from whom I learned a lot of computer science. He was probably in the 8th and I was in the 5th, and we started writing programs in C and assembly together late into the night. My parents were worried, was I talking to a girl? But it was always Arun. And then, but interests like these, at least in my case, sort of tended to consume me. to the point where, and I'm not suggesting students do this, to the point where I began to neglect things in school. And I think that's when I met Mrs. Pratima Rao, who provided a very nice balance, and more than anything else, provided a safe environment where she actively encouraged people like Arun and I to pursue our passion in computer science. And I don't think I've ever had as much fun doing computer science as I did when I was in school, in this environment that Mrs. Rao provided. And I'm not exaggerating, I really mean this. So having said all that, I take sort of this, my take on this topic of creativity is slightly different. I look at it perhaps from the perspective of, in the age of machines, in the age of technology, what does creativity mean? What do humans do, and what must they do, as opposed to what do they do today? And so I'll start with something like this that you see here, which are a couple of haikus, which are actually, you know, if you think about it, you know, these are pretty okay haikus by some measure. But it turns out these haikus are actually written by a computer, not by humans. This is written by a computer that learned how to write haikus by looking at the headlines of the New York Times for about 3 years or so. And that will really try to sort of, I try to give another spin of this topic of creativity. And what I'd sort of call it today was probably something like this, from carbon to silicon. And as we go along, you'll see, you know, why this title. So I'll start with, you know, somewhat of a truism. Today, software is eating the world. How many of the younger people in the audience recognize the thing to the left? There we go, yeah, Pac-Man, for the perhaps the more evolved generations. And why do we say this? Okay, we have this reality, Uber or Ola or whatever else, if you will. Today is a taxi company, but it owns no taxis. It's one of the largest taxi companies, but it owns no taxis. Airbnb is amongst the largest hotels, but owns no hotels. Alibaba or Amazon is the largest retailer, but owns no warehouses and or no inventory in a sense. Netflix is the largest distributor of movies, and it owns no movie theaters. Flipboard is amongst the most popular magazines, and it owns no press. Now, 15 years ago, if any of these ideas or companies were to exist, each one of them would have been software companies that built software. For example, Uber would have built software for a taxi company, as opposed to being a taxi company itself. Or Airbnb would have built software for a hotel chain, as opposed to being a hotel itself. And so this is, in a sense, how the world has really changed, particularly in the last 7 or 8 years. And this is a dramatic change, because the common thread across all of these is that they're all software companies that are providing services. And essentially, these are software companies that are innovating in terms of the business models. And they're disrupting industries that we have known for the last 100, 200, 300, 400 years in a way that we have never even thought was possible. And so these we are all very familiar with. But my point really is that there's something that is, there's the ground beneath us is shifting in a way that's even more fundamental than any of these things. And to sort of begin to understand this, let's start with a question, a very seemingly simple question of what is a computer? What is the purpose of a computer? And my sort of, this is a question actually, to be honest, I never really thought about until about a year ago. Even when I used to teach at university and so on, I never really thought about what is the end goal of all these things. And then it dawned on me, or at least this is my answer, the purpose of a computer really is that it's all about productivity. And what do we mean by productivity? Well, there are 4 dimensions, or at least the way I see it. Something ought to be faster because of computers. You ought to have fewer errors in some shape or form. There's got to be some kind of more transparency in some shape or form, and it should cost you a lot less. Each one of these things is quite true when you think of using an Ola cab or an Uber cab or you know, any of the other examples that I mentioned earlier on. And to sort of drive home this point a little bit further of how productivity really matters and software really, or computers enable more productivity, I'll tell you a few stories. You know, I'll start with a very simple story. This is the first story. I hope everybody in this room recognizes this man. This is, I think, a picture from 1994. He's sitting on a pile of papers, and you can't even see the beginning of where this pile starts. And the disc he holds in his hand is a CD. This is, in his book, The Road Ahead, I think. And the idea is that the CD holds more information than all the papers that he's sitting on. So again, think about productivity, right? And everything is sort of expressed very quickly and easily. Here's a second story, the apocryphal story, I think, of the apple falling on Newton's head. So if you did science about 400 years ago, you had supposedly an episode like this, and then you came up with a theory that shook the world and you moved on. And then today we have something like this, which is the Large Hadron Collider in CERN, which I have several colleagues of mine who are engineers working on this thing. This produces 30, petabytes of data each year. That means 30 into 10 to the power of 15. That's more than the number of humans that we'll ever have on this planet. Each year we're producing tremendous amounts of data. And so just think of how science has changed from in the last 500 years, how you do science. And all this data is, of course, used for observations and making, ratifying old theories or coming up with new theories and so on. And again, all of this is possible. Why? Because there's software that powers most of these machines. And then we come to a third story, which, in my opinion, is perhaps the most profound story of how software is eating the world, and it's all about productivity. This is an image of a telescope, which is about, I think, 200 inches in length, so it's a massive building, known as the Palomar telescope. It's the largest telescope in California. And the story about this telescope is as follows. It turns out there are 2-3 other telescopes around it. So you see in the bottom right is the massive telescope. The top left is a smaller one, and sort of in the middle there's another smaller one. So a team of astrophysicists at Caltech have completely automated these telescopes end to end, to the point where the telescopes are automatically scanning the sky, taking high-resolution photos, about 30 frames per second, constantly, sending all this data to a supercomputer at Berkeley, and in software they do all the mathematics, the physics, and all the discoveries on all these images. And then they have a database of previous discoveries. So for example, on the left-hand side you see a reference image and you see a new image, and this is software doing all of this. It compares the two and it subtracts and says, hey, I found a supernova, an exploding star, or sometimes you have things that are not accurate, like that you see on the right-hand side. But the point really is this, which is in 1981, if you were an astronomer, it took you about 2 years to make one significant discovery. Today, this team, without any humans in the loop, and with software that runs the whole thing, are able to make significant new discoveries that mankind has never made before, every 5 hours. And if you sort of step back and think a little bit, right? Staring up at the heavens and wondering about our place in the universe is really sort of, in my mind at least, the beginning of most things in life. It's the beginning of religion, it's the beginning of science, it's the beginning of poetry, literature, so on and so forth. And what we have essentially said at this point is that we have completely automated that old human activity away, and we have software that does it for us, and there's no human in the loop. That should really shake you in terms of how software is changing the world. At least to me, the idea that you can take mankind's oldest activity and have machines do it even better than humans can is sort of, it's earth-shattering or earth-shaking. Here's an example of one of their discoveries, and they found this little thing here. In fact, there's more data and details available online. But again, this is a story of how productivity has changed because of software. Now, I'll tell you a fourth story, which is not entirely about software, but it's inspiration that we can draw from. It's about productivity. This is Henry Ford on the right-hand side, and on the left-hand side are the Model Ts. These are sort of the cars that changed the way cars were manufactured and would be accessible to all of us. And Henry Ford figured out a way in which he could produce these cars at massive scale and do it so much cheaper. He used to have this saying that he wanted every factory worker working on these cars to be able to afford each one of the cars that they were actually making. In fact, if you sort of, this is some data where as the production of these cars went up, the cost came down dramatically from nearly $1,000 to less than $200 as a result of what Henry Ford did. This is a great example of productivity. So now if you a few years later, you look at the General Motors assembly plant in 1922, I think this or so. This is an image from the Library of Congress. You sort of see many humans here working on a car, right? This is great, but now let's see how cars are made today. It's exactly the same assembly line, and cars are made this way. Where are the humans? There are no humans here, right? In fact, these are robots built by a company called as KUKA Systems. It's a German company that completely obviate the need for any human effort when making these cars. And these are the cars that pretty much most of us drive in and so on. And so I'll come to my final productivity story. Now, some of you may say, yeah, this is fine, but surely computer science has done something about productivity. We're more productive within computer science itself. Yes, we are. So in 1981, if you were to ask me to write, don't worry about the details on the slide, the point is simply this. If you were to ask me to write some code in assembly, which is a language that was more popular then, that would read data from a file and print a screen, I would write all these things down. Okay, the same task 18 years later in 1999, when I would write it in a language like Java, it would take me 9 lines, this very same task. And the same task in 2005 would take me 1 line, right? So clearly we have improved productivity of computer science itself. So there is an improvement there. But my whole argument is that this so-called progress is entirely insufficient. And to better understand why, let's start with a very basic question once again. So what is a computer? This is a story that at least I did not learn in school. I learned in college when I was reading the history of science, which goes back to what Rahul was saying. I think whether you're an engineer or doctor or a lawyer or whatever else, you ought to sort of read the humanities. You ought to read philosophy, science, history, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to show you a picture of the world's first computer, and it's going to surprise many of you here. This is the actual picture of the world's first computer. This is the world's first computer. If you sort of, it's kind of, the font is too small, it says, the late Mr. Babbage. We all learned in school that Charles Babbage was the father of computing. He built the difference engine and the analytical engine, or parts of the analytical engine. But it turns out Charles Babbage himself had a job called as a computer. He was called as a computer. What do I mean by this? Well, here's a clipping from the New York Times in 1892. The word computer was not a machine. Historically, the word computer for 500 years was a job title. It was just like saying reader or accountant or whatever else. You are also a computer. And if you read the history of science, this is what you'll find. And so here you see, I hope everybody can read, it's clear enough, you could actually apply, and there are advertisements to get a job as a computer for humans. So much so that this is a very important image in the history of science. If you Google the words Harvard computers, this is the image that comes up. These 18 women in this picture were known as Harvard computers. These were mostly housewives who were hired by the one man in the picture, who was a professor at Harvard in astronomy, and his name was Charles Pickering. And he hired these women for 25 cents per hour, which at the time was a little bit more than a factory worker and a little bit less than a clerical worker. And all day long, they would sit down and compute. That is, they would do multiplication, division, log tables, so on and so forth. And what Pickering would do is he would say, if I give you this kind of data, you apply this sequence of operations, this other kind of data, these other sequence of operations, and so on. Okay? And so if you sort of look at the encyclopedia of what is a computer, back in the day, it would say this. I've highlighted some interesting words in red. You don't have to really read the whole thing, but really the point is that it's a job title. And it goes on. Imagine you had a job hour after hour, day after day, you're doing nothing but computing multiplication, so on and so forth. So this is really what a computer was. And also, by the way, there's literature contrary to this, where if you read what people thought of these jobs and people thought of this kind of human effort, 100 years ago, people would say, this is really creative human endeavor. You need the power of the human mind. There is no machine can do this, and so on. It was inconceivable. Though Charles Babbage, about 200 or 300 years ago, did think, saying, hey, can I compute with steam? Because remember, he was contemporaries with Robert Louis Stevenson. But nonetheless, people thought this was all about creativity and human endeavor. And this is how it really ties into this whole theme of, if you look back into the history of computing, we always thought this job of computing was a creative endeavor. And we all know how that has changed today, or has it? So this is an image from around between World War I and World War II. I don't have the exact dates. What you see here is a room full of women, and women played a very important role in the history of computing, by the way, something that, again, we didn't necessarily learn in school. And they're all computing for the US Naval and War Departments. They're computing ballistic charts, missile projectile charts, and so on. Again, they were doing basic calculations. And their job titles was computer. Okay, so this was early in the 20s. So let's look at what computers look like today. So this is what computers look like today. So the question really is that, I don't mean the computers on the desk. I'm referring to the humans, of course. And my point here is that, has anything really changed? Sure, instead of using, back in time, they were using punch cards or some little devices on their tables, and the nature of those devices have changed. But we still have a large number of humans performing these kinds of tasks. Think about the contrast in manufacturing, where you have these assembly lines where there are no humans and you have these robots. And then think about what we see here today. We have millions of people who are performing tasks where essentially they're emulating machines as opposed to machines emulating humans. And so my argument really is that not much has changed. Now sure, maybe a job of a computer 100 years ago was a creative endeavor, but today it's no longer a creative endeavor, and yet we treat it like a creative endeavor. Why do I say that? Let me show you some data. So I just picked up some, you can't see sort of the x-axis, the colors are perhaps a little too dark. It starts from 2005, the left-hand side, and goes up till about 2015. I just took the top 5 tech companies in India, and I looked at the number of humans that they have hired in the past 10 years. Just 5 companies. Of course, if I include the entire industry, it's, the numbers are still very big. And what you find here is between them, there are about between 750 to nearly 1 million people have been hired. And most of whom are doing the kinds of jobs that I showed you earlier on, who are working on tasks that machines frankly can do much better, that don't require human creativity. And yet this continues to go on. In fact, to put it a slightly different way, if, this is about 15 times the strength that one company like Google has, just in terms of headcount, or 100 times of Google's size from 2005. And so really the question here is, why do we need so many of these people performing these kinds of tasks? And to sort of, to recast this question of what I'm saying, we go back to our favorite Pac-Man. So this is software, and in the last 100 years or 50 years, what software has really done is it has sort of gone and influenced and changed the way various industries operate. Whether you're in retail or in banking or whatever else, there are many, many industries. They've all fundamentally changed, become more efficient, they've become more productive as a result of software, or software playing a big role in this. But what I'm really saying is that it's time to sort of re-examine this picture and say, maybe this is what needs to happen next, which is software needs to do itself what it has done to others. And so this obviously then brings us to another question, saying, oh, are you now saying software should replace all humans? No, I'm not saying that at all. There is definitely still a lot of room for genuine creative human endeavor and human intelligence. So what do I mean by intelligence? Well, my answer for intelligence is the ability to solve a previously unseen problem. And machines can't do this right now. But on the other hand, what machines can do is something like this. Any task where you have nearly deterministic rules, And what do we mean by deterministic? Which means that you're not really using your judgment or expertise or creativity. Machines ought to be doing this. And so sort of this view is based off two working hypotheses. The first of which is that I strongly believe most people, including myself, for all of us, what we do for most part of almost every day is actually nearly deterministic. We have a bunch of rules that we're following, and we're not used to thinking of them as rules, but implicitly they are rules. And so it's very rarely do you have for the human mind some sort of a genuine creative human endeavor. And when those moments happen, it's brilliant. You know, you have very deep insights and everything seems worth it. But pretty much apart from that, a lot of what we do is actually not that creative on a daily basis. And this then ties into a second hypothesis, which is systematically, if you look at sort of the productivity of humans in any task, my hypothesis is that if a human is highly productive in a given task, it's very likely that this task ought to be done by a machine. Because human beings tend to be very highly productive only when they have figured out rules for doing a job well. You know, case in point, you ask somebody to sort of be creative and paint a new painting of some kind. It's hard to be productive and produce 100 a day. On the other hand, you ask a person, you teach a person to paint one painting sort of exactly a certain way, as they do in parts of China, from where you get the world's largest replicas of paintings, and you can do about 30, 40 a day. The latter is not a creative task. The former is a creative task. And so inherently humans are very productive when we have when we figured out rules to doing things. And therefore, ironically, when human beings become very productive, machines will actually take over these tasks. And so there has sort of been a broader thrust, I think, in academia and certainly in industry, and this is the way that I interpret the word crossroads when we were discussing this topic or email, where I think the thrust has been to think of how do we build a general purpose machine that will serve as a replacement for humans in the tech industry itself. Because the tech industry has done this to every other industry, but never to itself. And this sort of a machine will have certain properties that, the best of what humans have, which is human beings are highly generalizable. We're adaptable, we're customizable, which are very powerful characteristics of humans. And at the same time, machines have good characteristics like they're very good at repetitive tasks. They can be faster than humans, hopefully cheaper and do with fewer errors and so on. And in fact, in trying to even sort of address this problem, there are people, again, in academia and industry who are solving very hard fundamental problems in computer science, from machine learning, distributed computing, to computer vision, programming languages, and so on and so forth. It's sort of this massive problem and a confluence of these different areas of computing that are coming together in creating more intelligent machines. There's another way to sort of look at this, right, which is over the last 50 years, the tech industry itself has built a large carbon footprint. By that I mean humans. And I was never good at chemistry in school, but I did find one good use for it. Because when I look at the periodic table, I see right below carbon in the periodic table is silicon, which I've highlighted in red. And this is the shift that is slowly going to happen beneath our feet, or is already happening. And so really what we'll move is from a world where you have something like this today, where you have companies and people and so on, where, if you imagine you have a client on the left-hand side and you have a company on the right-hand side where they have a pyramid of humans that they construct who are doing all kinds of gymnastics to build software, to maintain it, and to deliver it. And this person, carries the load of it and finally delivers this software to the client. This will change. And it will change because what we're going to witness is going to be a digitization of the actual human labor workforce in the technology industry. And this will change to something like this, where you will still have humans, except you won't have humans actually doing many of these tasks. They will be done by intelligent beings of some kind. And so I think, this is my last slide. What, at least in my mind, it will make, we ought to reflect and we should think about a little bit more, is what are the kinds of things that humans are genuinely meant for? If machines are in a rat race with us in trying to catch up and doing more and more things that we can do, then what should human endeavor and creativity really ought to do? Things like what Rahul does, I don't think machine will be able to do, at least hopefully not in our lifetime or in my lifetime. But there are many other things that I think in today's practical world that machines will definitely bridge the gap and will do. The answer is not clear of what we would, we as humans would do. There will be effects on society as a result of this, and we cannot wish this away. In a sense, what I'm telling you is nothing new. What I'm telling you is the continuation of the Industrial Revolution, except it'll now happen at a pace that we have never witnessed before. And it'll happen to many of us who never thought that this would happen to many of us. The one sort of, in various other forums, people ask me saying, oh, but this is not good. We must not do this. This should not happen. But the truth of it is most of us have bought into this reality. Because if we did not, your cars would cost you 1,000,000 times more, or your can of soda would cost you, 100 times more, and so on and so forth. In almost every aspect of our lives, whether it's clothes to whatever else we consume, we have accepted this reality. And I think going forward, there will be this other dramatic shift that will make us rethink what it means to be human. And I think with that, I'm really done. And thank you very much.
Thank you both for a very intellectually stimulating and very divergent take on a similar topic. We could see the contrast of Elphick and Pettigrew at play. You did indicate that computing, in a sense, has showed man his place and shown us how small we are, in a sense, in the universe, which I think was a very profound point, because that in many ways should be our starting point to get more creative, to understand exactly who and where we are. But you also paradoxically said that computers, in a sense, are now doing our thinking for us, and therefore stifling our creativity. So I want to know from you, what should one do in terms to fight this tendency to dumb down because of computers, do your own thinking yourself, be more creative? And I wonder if you could link that to your Murty Classical Library, which I think is a very important aspect I would like you to talk to us about, because that very clearly is a form of multidisciplinary creativity that you have found.
So Aditya, I have a couple of things to say about this. The first of which is, I do believe there is very genuine space for human creativity, that machines, at least insofar as all the computer science that I know, machines will not come to touch in the near future. I don't yet know of a machine that can write an essay as well as a human, or with the same sort of flowing beauty of, as a human can. But having said that, I think we humans are involved in far too many things where we are actually mimicking machines. Perhaps 100 years ago it didn't look like that, but certainly it looks like that today. Now, having said that, I want to share one anecdote, and I'll tie it back to what I learned in school. So I thought I was quite good in mathematics when I was in school, and then I went to college. And one of the things that, we prided ourselves in mathematics in school was you could do integrals in calculus in our heads. Because I don't remember if they allowed calculators or not in exams, but the idea that you could do it very quickly and so on, you were macho if you did that. So when I was at university, I found that many of my classmates who had come from other countries and other colleges and other schools used a calculator, but at the same time had a far better fundamental intuitive understanding of what calculus meant and how to apply it in various situations, whereas I didn't know any of those things. Instead, I was very good at doing it very quickly. So the joke used to be that you're no better than my calculator. That's what my friends would tell me. And that's a great example of me being a product of a system of education where I learned to follow a bunch of steps and do it very quickly. And that's, I mean, and in a sense, why do you need that skill today? You don't. And my friends were right. It was perhaps far more important to have a contextual understanding of the basics of calculus and how you can apply it to various contexts than being able to do it very quickly. So that is an example of sort of where I think, you know, machines will be useful and where genuine human creativity will still play out. And coming back to what you said, I got asked this question or something along these lines when we were doing the Classical Library launch in London. And I said to this person, I said, look, I would not yet bet on machines to do these translations as well as any of the scholars who are doing the translations, because the scholars who are doing the translations have studied it all their lives. And it's not a one-to-one word translation, you know, it's translations in a sense of emotions, of feelings, and trying not to lose them when you go from the source language to English. So in my mind, none of what I said really, as yet, applies to, you know, a translation effort in the classics.
Thank you, Rohan. Rahul, you, I think, very profoundly brought out a nuance as to how the humanities could not be useless and a threat at the same time, which I think was food for thought. You've had the benefit of going to some of the best institutions in India and in the UK and elsewhere, and you also now teach. I just wonder what your take is on the sort of the structures or the atmosphere that you've found here and there, and how do they compare in terms of furthering creativity, fostering creativity, and also in a sense insulating you from the challenges that you talked about?
Thanks for the question, Aditya. I think one of the things that strikes me is, in a sense, how similar the pressures are in different places. They often have different effects because, obvious fact, institutions in different countries have different resource bases. But the pressures of a situation in which the state is doing less and less for education and relying much more on the private sector and philanthropy are being felt everywhere. And especially now in the UK, which it may interest many of the audience to know that till very recently in the UK, university education was free. You could go to the best universities and not pay any fees at all. And I'm talking till the mid-1990s. So you could go to Oxford or Cambridge and not pay a fee. And that's changed, and it's beginning to change very rapidly. So state support is declining, and in that situation of decline, the humanities are suffering more than anything else, precisely because of this assumption that they are not as useful, instrumentally useful as other subjects. So in that sense, I think my comments are not limited to the situation in India at all. They're much more comparable. I would just say, I can't help but react to Rohan's amazing talk, and I think you said the talks were divergent, but actually I saw much more convergence, because for me, as Rohan brought out so well, I think the flip side of the question, what is the purpose of a computer, is what is the purpose of a human, right? In a sense, and that's the question the humanities have always been asking. And our answers to that question might change as the world changes and as technology changes, but it is, in a sense, the eternal question.
As short as possible.
My name is Dr. Shiv Shastri. Please pardon me for not standing up. I have a back issue. I'd just like to make a comment that links up both Rahul Rao and Rohan Murty. If you search on the internet, you will find an image, a painting of Jesus Christ sodomizing himself. This is very creative. You know, this is a picture of what Jesus Christ is supposed to look like, and he's having anal sex with himself. Is this creativity or is this chicanery? Shiv is my first name. My mother taught me to worship, you know, Vishnu and Shiva. This was worship, it was not sex. I was never taught to worship an erect penis. Wendy Doniger seems to feel that a linga is an erect penis. Fine, that's all right. I really think that this business of returning awards is a narrow bunch of people who wrote books. Nowadays, with the internet, there is freedom. There are hundreds of people with blogs, people on internet fora who are able to express their opinions, and the people who've written books who thought that they had said it all and that they owned literature are now finding so much resistance that they don't know how to handle it. And thank God for the internet and computers. I wonder if you have a reaction to that.
Would either of you want to take that?
Thanks for that question. I can't comment on the particular representation you're talking about because I haven't seen it. And I also think that merely looking at the picture would not answer the question, because everything has a context, and I would want to know the context of its creation, who created it, what the intention was. And so appreciating a work of art or a work of religious iconography or a work of iconoclasm, it might be any of those three things, is a complicated thing. I don't think you can just look at something, and certainly you can have a view, but an informed view would require much more. But I think the argument I was making is not so much about endorsing the content, agreeing or disagreeing with the particular arguments that these authors have made, right? What I have been arguing in defense of is the space to agree to disagree. In a sense, that is what is at stake in these disputes, right? So it is perfectly legitimate for people to have contrary views, to think that those arguments and interpretations are flawed, to criticize those using the space of the internet, as you say, which I agree has been a massive democratizing force in terms of enabling people with access to the internet. So not full and perfect democracy, because as we know, that too is limited. But it has been a democratizing force. I would disagree that the returning of the awards is just to attract attention to oneself. In many cases, it has attracted the opposite of positive attention, such as the comments you just made. So there has been an element of risk. There has been an element of attack that these people have incurred, not just praise. And I think where something comes with risk and not the certainty of reward, it is something that I respect. It means that people are standing up for what they believe in. And we may disagree with the content of that belief, but I think I certainly respect the courage and integrity it takes to stand up for that belief, even if it might be unpopular.
Thank you, Rahul. Seal number 2, please.
Being a little older than you, I've learnt a lot, because you have the benefit of youth and inexperience. But when you look around and you see the mythologization of history, which is non-history, you see rampant majoritarianism in all societies, acknowledged or unacknowledged. You see the beginning of, from the 90s, and your products of that period, of consensual totalitarianism, the most advanced type in the most advanced countries, particularly Europe, and very efficient city-states in Asia, where you're tracked, everything is known about you, and you're given a little bit of freedom. So the main point is, this is an atmosphere where the medical profession wants to abolish death, governments want to abolish privacy because you're a danger to some image. And what should education do? Basically, we wanted to hear from the software side and this side. We don't expect answers, but we want you to represent your generation. I think we know more than you about the total picture. It's not a new software solution, or put up Nehru and too much of Nehru has done this and he should be brought down. This is very easy, it's very childish. So this is a point on which I request you to exercise yourself, not to answer me, but to remember that it's a very dangerous and insidious climate, and much more in the Western countries, where the so-called majority, you can't go out of line. Only some things are permitted, which is general. And all this computerization, all this thing, I think we were much freer when we were young. And I fear that the freedom of our children and grandchildren is going to be much less. Thank you.
Would either of you like to respond to that? It's a generational challenge thrown to you by a 1949 batch Cottonian, if I'm right.
So far be it for me to represent all of my generation. I'll certainly represent myself. You know, some of what you said, right? I'll admit that in general I was very unaware of these issues when I was a person sitting at the back in school. We never read whatever history we read in school. I mean, I wonder how many of the kids here really know any Indian history. You know Revolt of 1857 and onwards. What do you know before that? What do you know 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, 500 years ago? So this is a severe deficiency that I felt, and I'm very sure I'm not alone. Much later on, after I left school, I did not have a great sense of where I came from. I mean, apart from my family and so on, of course. And I think this sort of ignorance in general is not very good and not helpful. And it only fuels any further divisions, because people, in my limited opinion, when I find people fighting online over things, you know, neither party really seems to know, you know, enough history or enough philosophy to be actually making either of their claims on either side. It's all somebody's conception or imagination that they want to put forward and say this is it and there's nothing else that's true, and the other side does exactly the same. So my own opinion is there has to, you know, one of the greatest disservices a nation can do to its young people is to not teach them where they come from. My American friends, they only have a 350-year history, but yet they're so proud of their constitution or whatever else that, you know, that they think is great about their nation. And yet, in India, I don't know what we were all taught to be very proud of. And we have much to be proud of. I'm not saying we have nothing. It's just that I felt a lot of it came from a lack of proper education. Which, since I have read a lot on my own, discussed with my friends and so on, I've made a lot of effort personally. But I think if there's perhaps a more, you know, if the system made it possible for, you know, people to be exposed to diverse ideas when they're young, that what was life like in India 2,000 years ago, what was philosophy like, what were debates like, I think it would surprise many of us, and we'd realize it was perhaps a far more open society, far more vibrant society, and then what most people are willing to admit today and are fighting over. That's what at least I'd say for somebody of my age.
Thank you, Rohan. Rahul, would you like to?
Yeah, just a quick response, very much in agreement. The joke used to be in college when I started studying history again, that history ended in 1947 and then civics began. Which is to say that we never learned the history of the present, we never learned how we got to this point where we are now. And that in effect what we were taught were duties of the citizen, but not so much how this idea of the citizen even came about in our context. But going back to your point, I think this idea of the tyranny of the majority is a real problem in all democracies. And it's the reason that we are supposed to have checks and balances in the form of institutions like the judiciary or the election commission or whatever. And those institutions often do very good work. But it also shows us that democracy on its own, and if we understand democracy as just the will of the majority, democracy on its own is not a perfect solution. It needs often to be balanced by something else. And there are often very real tensions between the democratic will of the majority and a sense of what might be right or liberal in a particular situation. And that's not a tension that's easy to solve. It's very hard to say, you know, the court is right and the executive is wrong. It's always a battle, and that, in a sense, is what politics is about.
Thank you, Rahul. Token number 3, please.
Very good morning. My name is Arita Chatterjee, ISC, Pakenham Walsh. I had 2 questions as a student of Standard 12 that I'd like to ask our 2 esteemed guests today. The first is, as a youth, probably looking at colleges and, you know, looking at life, I would like to ask Cornell and Harvard alumni and an esteemed lecturer as to how do the 2 of you deal with failure? How do the 2 of you deal with scenarios where y'all have worked tirelessly towards something but have not achieved what y'all might have wanted to. And my second question, again, as a youth embarking upon this so-called large journey of life, in a hypothetical situation of being a youth who has an idea, who wants to create, who wants to innovate, in a competitive world such as ours, as Mr. Rahul had first said that, you know, there are ideas, there is creation, but it is being destroyed by the outside world. How does a youth protect his idea from external damage, from criticism, and bring out that idea out to the forefront? Thank you very much.
Excellent questions.
Well, that's a great question. And I'm very tempted to lapse into cliches. And the first cliche that comes to mind is, of course, the one about failure being the stepping stone to success and all that. But actually, there is some truth to all cliches, right? That's why they hang around. And I think what that one means is that I think it means a couple of things. It means first, in the course of failing, you often learn something. At least you learn what doesn't work, but you might also learn that maybe the question you were asking is not the right one, or maybe there are other questions to ask that are more interesting. One of the things I found that is most useful is boredom, right? When you're bored, that's telling you something very important, and I've learned not to ignore boredom, to take it seriously as a clue, as a kind of feedback mechanism that something is a dead end and you need to try something else. So I don't have an easy answer to the failure question, but it always happens. Everybody fails, and you probably fail more than you succeed, so you kind of have to get used to it also. And your second question was about how as a young person one might deal with the kinds of threats to creativity that I was talking about. I think my most important thought on that would be that it's very hard to deal with these things as individuals, that we need to make community and we need to find community, and this is what movements are about. This is why social movements matter and exist, because individuals cannot deal with these situations on their own. And so I would suggest that this should lead us to look for people who think like us, to make common cause with them, to cooperate in the process of making something better. We live in a world where incentives are very often individual focused, and that sometimes disincentivizes working together in groups, and sometimes we need to ignore those incentive structures or create alternative incentive structures, which is also something nobody can do on their own. So it's a bit of a complicated answer, but I think you asked a very complex question, so you got what you deserved.
Spoken like a true school captain. Rohan, would you want to supplement? No, Rohan will pass. Token 4, please.
Batch of 2000. I'm your junior, Rahul, and your senior, Rohan. I kind of differ with you, Rohan, on the fact that you responded to the question saying you don't actually speak for your generation. But in a sense, the three of us, in fact, the whole batch of students of that 10-year period actually are the generation that has enjoyed a certain liberal freedom that the country has never experienced before. I'm struck by the image that we're seeing right now, which is the picture of General Thimayya in the backdrop and the two of you in front. I was deeply moved by your invocation of both Fanon and Gandhi, and especially how they sit on polar opposites of violence. And I was also struck by the fact that we spoke about convergence and divergence. So this is an attempt at a synthesis. What strikes me is that there's a generational schism. And maybe one way to just quickly get to that schism is in military education, we have this notion saying, you can't manage your troops into battle, you have to lead them. So my question to you is about leadership. And both of you have come at it from different angles, science and art, the humanities and politics. What is it about this interim generation, what is it about our generation, perhaps, and what is it about that preceding generation that we have lost in terms of leadership? And what can we actually do to make that sense of leadership reemerge, especially when we have this schism of leadership of people and of management, of systems, of incentive structures, of social relations of production, all of those things. So question to both of you on leadership, really.
Ram, I don't know, for those of you who don't know, Ram was a year senior to me. I used to sit next to him for the ISC exams, and he was one of our best playwrights at the time. And he had actually concocted a play along the lines of The Matrix, which those days was very cool, called Arcana, Secret of the Catharsis. And I think I embarrass him every time I mention that. Ram, I don't know what to tell you, because I think I perhaps don't yet have a platform on which to answer your super deep question. And I'll defer to my very respectful senior.
That was slimy. But I mean, the one nice thing that's come out of this is that apparently we are all the same generation, which I'm grateful for. So that's great. Okay. Generational schisms. You know, as you were talking, the text that occurred to me was Sun Tzu's Art of War, right? Which many of you might have read. And it's certainly a text that's been read across hundreds of years. It's a text about warfare, and maybe this is a text that unites all of us, right? Including General Thimayya, who may have read it, probably did read it at some point. I've always been curious about why people are still reading this text from hundreds of years ago, and why people are reading it across so many different fields, why business people read it as much as people in the military or in politics. It's a very elusive text. A lot of it is riddles, and it doesn't purport to offer direct advice. But one of the things it brings out is how intellectual an activity fighting is, right? That it's not just about brute force, it's also about thinking. And the other thing that comes out of it is Sun Tzu's comments about how a clever strategist is one who fights as little as possible, and in a sense achieves their objectives in other ways by using the advantages of territory and surprise and all of the resources at their call. So I'm not sure there's a schism. I think there are some of these things are continuities across generations and across fields. And certainly other things have changed, but I think I also want to emphasize some of the continuities that we still appeal to here.
Thank you, and thanks for that question, Ram. Token 5, at the back.
My name is Mohammed Sultan, and I am from Pakenham Walsh House. My question to Rahul is that, what can we do as the youth of this country when history is interpreted according to the lunatic fringes, and what is the role of the state in promoting liberal and rational ideas in the society?
Excellent question.
Thank you.
So I think the question about the role of the state is very important, because one of the common comebacks to the sort of argument I made is that, under a previous political regime, another version of history was promoted. Why is this version any worse than that version? They are both political. And I think that's a legitimate criticism and something that we should think about. I suppose what I am suspicious of are versions of history writing or forms of history writing that are intended to inculcate purely pride in the past, right? That kind of exercise, I think, is not history so much as propaganda. I'm much more persuaded by an account of history that holds a mirror up to the past, warts and all, right? The past is both a source of pride and a source of shame. And as a society, we need to be conscious of both of those things. And different versions of history may choose to emphasize different elements of pride and shame. But unless they do both, I think there is something very suspect about the role that the state, under whatever party, is playing.
Thank you. Token 6, please.
I have two questions. My first question is to Mr. Murty. During your school time, or might be your entire life, you might have been looked up with expectations by everyone. Being the son of Narayana Murty, there were teachers, as you said, had expectations from you. Did this hamper your creativity, or did this make you strive more to perform better. How did you handle this? And my second question is, lots of people think that, even me, like, you can't discover more. Like this, everything is discovered. Maths, that's so many theorems. If I become a mathematician, what is there for me to do? This hampers their creativity. What would you say to them?
I told you these kids are going to be tough.
No, the first is I never said there were any teachers had expectations. On the contrary, I have been skinned several times by Mr. Iqbal Ahmed, who didn't care whose parent, whose son, daughter, father, grandchild you are. All those things were irrelevant. So I think that was actually one of the nicer things in school for me. If I did well, my teacher said you did well, and if I didn't do well, which is quite often, or I didn't polish my shoes or didn't have my tie or whatever, I had to do duck walks around First 11 several times. So there's a very liberating experience, doing duck walks early in the morning, and it's just like everybody else. So I think that way school was a very normalizing force. We all wore the same uniform. It was perfect. Your second question, it's not just mathematics, and I'm sure Rahul will also agree. There is, whether it's, let's say you want to do mathematics or theoretical physics or history or philosophy, you should do these things because you enjoy them, at least at this age. At least that would be my message to you, because I didn't think necessarily like that at the time, and I wish I did. I kept thinking in terms of what job would I get, what would I do next, and so on. But if you're a reasonably hardworking and somewhat smart person and you get lucky, things will work out fine. But you must sort of follow that which you really enjoy. If I could do it all over again, I would certainly have done a second degree in philosophy, almost certainly, which I didn't have the maturity and the insight and the sort of the intellectual bandwidth to realize that, hey, it may be okay to also do computer science and philosophy. It was sort of a heresy to me in my head those days. So I'd say, you need to sort of break out of that way of thinking as to what is the use of this thing necessarily. I don't know.
Thanks, Rohan. Question 7, please.
My name is Christy Cherian. I'm class of 63, Elphick House, and I live in the UK. Both of you spoke about creativity, which is something very close to my heart. I know the UK for the last 40 years or so, and I still think it's one of the most creative and innovative places. I would have liked to have heard both of you speak about what is it we would do to inculcate creativity within schools, within young people. Because the future is not many of us older guys. We've done whatever we've done. So can you tell just a few comments or pointers to what can be done to inculcate creativity? Thank you.
It's a very difficult question for me, partly because I feel like I'm at the beginning of my career and I just haven't thought about these questions long enough. But one of the words that struck me in Rohan's presentation was he used the word disruption, which has become a bit of a buzzword, right? For good reason in many industries and sectors. And in a sense, that was also, it made me think about rebellion in a political sense. Creativity requires breaking rules in some sense, and this is always at tension with another set of things that we are trying to do in schools and educational institutions, which is to enforce rules. When I was in school, I feel like the word I heard most often was discipline. So there is a tension. We want both of these things. We want both discipline and rebellion. We want people to follow rules, but we also want people to break rules. And it's very difficult to communicate both of those things together at the same time. I think the trick is that people have to find something worth rebelling against. Rebellion for its own sake is not very edifying or useful. And that really is an individual struggle. Each person has to figure out what it is they want to change about the status quo. And from that dissatisfaction with the status quo and desire to shift something, to break some established way of doing things, I think from that creativity emerges.
Excellent. Thank you, Rahul. Question 8, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Abhinav Dutt. I'm from Standard 11, Pakenham Walsh House. And my question is to Dr. Rohan Murty. Now, Dr. Rohan Murty proposed a very interesting hypothesis on how every job today that's deterministic or has a deterministic set of rules and requires very little independent thinking, that should be done by machines. So as a proponent of this hypothesis, I would like to ask you how you wish to compensate for the millions of people who earn a living by doing such deterministic jobs and are probably aren't skilled or educated enough to do something that's classified as creative.
Another excellent question.
No, that's a very good question. I get asked this question a fair bit, and frankly, I don't think there's a very good answer, but I'll try, because we have seen cycles of this throughout the Industrial Revolution, and invariably, a certain subset of people stand to lose. This happened in the 20th century when manufacturing fundamentally changed, and there's a generation of people who are suddenly stuck where, you know, they didn't necessarily have, you can't easily retrain. Now, having said that, let me narrow your question a little bit more down to technology, and perhaps I can answer your question then. Here's the thing, right? If you're probably too young to know, there was a language called Fortran. So when in the 80s, if you were a Fortran programmer, you were the hottest thing ever. But today, if you're a Fortran programmer, nobody knows what it is, right? So inherently in technology, the rate at which things change is so fast that you're almost always required to constantly learn and relearn. And if you cannot do that, you tend to lose out. And the barriers to learning and relearning and to acquiring new skills in technology are actually relatively lower. And so the only defense you have against these sorts of massive shifts, I would say even in technology, will be the ability to learn and relearn very quickly. And I think that we have at least sort of been able to demonstrate in technology for the last 30 years. So perhaps the effects need not be as bad as they have been in other areas where there's been sort of massive mechanization and so on.
Thank you. Yes, sir. Token 9 now. And thank you for graciously letting me.
I am Colonel Reddy. I'm a medical doctor. So my question to both of you, more concerned to the political Rahul. We have creativity, wonderful lectures both of you gave, and you really enlightened, educated us today. The creativity, I feel, it has got two rather classifications. One is a negative creativity and the positive creativity. A classical example of positive creativity and negative creativity is an atomic energy, which can be used negatively for destruction of the whole world, positively for the production of the electricity. Now, another example is that the negativity and positivity, we are making our country, elevating our status, popularizing ourselves, familiarizing all the countries, spreading our name.
So your question, please, sir, could you please put your question now?
We are coming up. So we are, sometimes it's sickening. I don't have any religion. I belong to a culture from army. We don't have creed, religion or caste, all such things. We are brought up in such. When we see society, we feel some sort of sickening. We create negativity.
Colonel, I'll have to request you to put your question, please, sir.
Negativity is...
We are seriously out of time. Your question, please.
Negativity, we are politicizing, creating, eating beef and so many other things, and creating a political...
Thank you, sir. So we'll take that as your comment then, and we will certainly reflect on it. Thank you very much, Colonel. Token number 10, please.
Good afternoon to everybody here. And the question goes to Rohan, I believe, who was the last speaker. I just heard the last bit of your speech. So I would like to thank you for your closing remarks, where you use the term "we as humans," because till then you were saying human. How do humans act? I thought, you may be a different species. On a lighter note, my question to you is, the last part of your talk you said, there'll be a time when all the machines, a lot of machines in place, and what will humans do? Am I right? That was your point, and also the youngster at the back said the same thing. Now, if you were to ask a Bangalorean,
Lokesh, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to ask you to ask your question, please.
Yeah. So my question is, what would you suggest humans do when machines take over?
Excellent question.
No, I'm not foreshadowing some apocalyptic future, machines take over and enslave humans and so on. I'm not saying any of that. In a sense, I think Rahul put it better than I could have, which is, it's the complement to his question, which is, what does it mean to be human? And that question needs to be thought of and answered over and over again, periodically, particularly in the age of machines. And far be it for me to prescribe what must humans do. I don't know. But let's not do things where we look like we are following a bunch of steps that machines can do. I don't think that's worth human effort and human time. And I mean, the human mind can do so much more than that. That's the only thing I would say.
Let's not stop thinking, is what you're saying. Yeah. Token 11, please.
I'm
Yes, ma'am.
Nazneen. I'm a biostatistician. I have a question for Rahul and one for Rohan. Rahul, when you said that non-experts are heading departments and areas, isn't that because to keep a check on bureaucracy? Because if you have too much power, then we can have another Hitler. And Rohan, a question for you is, isn't the machine and humans, there will always be interdependence. Like algorithms, can the machine write an algorithm? Humans produce the algorithm which the computer carries on. Thank you.
Thanks. That's a great question. I think there is a place for expertise, and there is also a place for non-experts to take decisions, particularly in a democratic system. For example, a lot of crucial decisions are rightly made by non-experts. We as voters are non-experts, but we make some of the biggest decisions of all in terms of deciding who should rule us. And likewise, politicians are often non-experts and also making crucial decisions, relying sometimes on the advice of experts like bureaucrats or specialists in certain fields. So I think there's a division of labor that we need to be thinking about. My point was a narrower one, which is that the particular positions I'm talking about are, I would have thought, positions that should be occupied by people who can lead the community that they are supposed to be administering, right? So when you have a community of historians being administered by somebody who is not considered a widely respected historian, he's not or she is not likely to know the kinds of problems that members of that profession face. It's as simple as that, in a sense. So expertise has its place, and likewise the generalists have their place as well. And I think we need to have a conversation about what are the appropriate realms for these different kinds of people.
And I agree with your second question in the form of a point, which is what I said. There are truly there are activities for which you need human intelligence. And again, by intelligence, I mean the ability to solve a problem you've never seen before. And for that, no, at least as of now, a machine can't do that yet. So if you take the specific example of devising a new algorithm, yeah, you would absolutely need a human endeavor and human effort. So I'm not saying humans will go away anywhere soon. It's just that we're doing far too many things that, make us actually look like machines right now.
12, please, and boys, we're almost done. 12.
That's why I already prepared my answer. Look, Pope House is getting a chance. Right? Okay, the only rep. 66 Pope, Venkamanda Bhatt. First, I must salute my warden, Reverend Thomas, for the wonderful schooling that I got here. It's turned us Cottonians into highly secular, fabulous citizens of this country. The second, I must salute that great general, General Thimayya, who was going to take over Kashmir, but Nehru went to the UN. Third, I must salute Aditya and all for bringing this platform, and Lastly, I must salute these two brilliant young men who've given us such a wonderful insight. So much so that I found with my analytical skills got in the National Defense Academy with my knowledge of the threat, I found that some of the answers were already given by them, yet they themselves could not see when they answered that. And for example, like Rohan said, and I've got a book on Hindutva in my bag, and that's the question that I want to pose to you guys. One is I want to ask Rohan, I get mixed up with this rhyming names because I'm a musician also. Rohan. Okay. I want to ask Rohan, you know, I'm a great fan of Asimov. I'm aware from the 60s from the 1760s we've had division of labor, we want to build a fabulous society.
Question please, Kiran.
Yeah. So, what's your take on Asimov's portrayal of the future? Second, I want to ask Rahul, which I've been recently doing, looking at Churchill's making of Pakistan to counter the bear and all the divisions that are taking place, and what Rahul said about, you know, both sides have to know their damn history. Very important. And so I've been looking into...
Question please, Kiran.
Yeah, these other guys of Hindutva, like, you know, what they say of Veer Savarkar, etc., reading their stuff, trying to get a balanced view on that. So I want to know, have you guys gone into that also? So these are my two questions.
Thank you. Rohan first, yeah? And feel free to keep your answers as short as you like.
I'll answer your question very conveniently. I'm a huge fan of Isaac Asimov's Foundation series. I read it every year. I've read it for the past 18 years as a ritual, every year. And for all the students in there, if you've not read it, you should read it. If you enjoy some sort of science fiction. And his vision of the future is one where, you know, ultimately there is hope. And there's always hope at least in the Asimov work I'm familiar with. So whether it's the robot series or whether it's Foundation and so on, there's always hope. And he uses, psychology and mathematics to bring hope. And so, which is not a bad idea. So I'd say, yeah, I agree.
The answer to your question is yes. Yes, in the sense that yes, I have been interested in these figures, and I think we ought to be. And more than just the people you named, I think a lot of the political issues we face today were anticipated by some of the drafters of the Constitution. The Constituent Assembly debates are some of the most interesting texts that we can look at, both for guidance and also, I think, to marvel at the sense of foresight that the drafters of the Constitution had.
Please, Rohan.
You know, I just want to add one more thing to the question and to what Rahul has said. I don't believe, we still do IC syllabus here. I don't believe we have any balanced view, whether it's history or literature or whatever else, at least in this syllabus. And I suspect CBSE is the same. And I'm quite surprised why after 65 odd years of independence, we read Shakespeare, we read Robert Frost, and I remember, I don't know if we still read, but we read, "Oh, Captain, my Captain, a fearful trip is done." It's about the American Civil War. In 9th standard here, we read James Joyce's Ulysses, and our teacher taught us Ithaca, it's Ithaca. And it's completely foreign context. I'm not saying we shouldn't read these things. And yet we never read a single classic, or we were never even aware of a single fact of, from this part of the world. That to me is really surprising. I mean, sure, pre-47 we can use the excuse of the English, but what is our excuse today? And so I find no balance, and unfortunately this debate is so polarized where, I was once saying this to a reporter friend of mine, she said, "Oh, are you one of those flying airplane nut jobs?" I said, "No, but that obviously is not true, but at the same time there are things that are true." Things like Pascal's triangle was actually first discovered in Sanskrit poetry. And it is not to lay claim to as being first, but there's a very different kind of aesthetic and very different kind of beauty of deriving mathematics out of poetry that not just being Indian, but anybody who's a member of the human race should appreciate. And yet we learn none of these things growing up in this country, or at least not in schools. Maybe some kids learn at home. And so I find there's been, at least the education I was subjected to, there's no balance. There was somebody's strange version of, very filtered down notion of knowledge that an Indian should have.
That somebody is the ICSE board.
Yeah, fair enough.
Serial number 13, please, and these are the last 3 questions.
Good afternoon, everyone present here. I'm Manvit of Standard 11, and I'm from Pope House. I feel honored to sit here along with Narayan Murty and Mrs. Sudha Murty. Well, the first time I heard of them was when I read one of the stories which was written by Mrs. Sudha Murty. If I'm not wrong, the name of the story being How I Taught My Grandmother to Read. Thank you, ma'am, for giving us the story. It was a really inspirational one. Well, coming to the question, I wanted to ask you a question which was based on the topic, but then you somehow managed to answer it before I could actually ask you the question. So let me ask you a more general question. How important do you feel it is to graduate from a good university to be a successful person in life? Because not everyone gets to go to Harvard as you did.
Well, it was a Harvard question.
You should have framed it better, man. I mean, he was a Rhodes Scholar going to Oxford, I mean, the problem with your question is that if I answer it either way, I'll still look like a jackass. Okay, let me put it this way, right? Your parents or my parents or many of the parents in this room probably never went to any of these fancy schools, and they did pretty all right. Our grandparents probably never went to any fancy schools, so they did pretty all right. So I don't necessarily think it's, or I don't think it's a necessary recipe for you to really do what you want to do. But having said that, you come to Bishop Cotton's versus going to any other school, right? Why is that? So you hope that you'll have peers who are, who will motivate you, in whose company you learn a lot and so on. So I think there's a certain kind of maybe exposure that you get going to some of the more well-known schools. And there is something to be said for it, but that's not the end of the world.
Rahul, would you like to add to that?
I totally agree. You don't have to go to university at all to be a successful person. It helps in a lot of ways, but it is not a necessary condition for success.
The penultimate question, 14, please.
Hi, yeah. Whole Pedigree House, ISC batch of 99, passed out somewhere in between the two of you. My question is for either of you, almost a follow-on to what was asked earlier. So we see a classic representation of the left brain analysis versus right brain on my either side here. And where we see that there is a threat or a potential of machines taking over a large number of our jobs, or at least somewhat to that extent. So do we see a shift to the right side, which, do you see a lot of people getting into creativity which is fostered and which might survive due to more freedom of expression, or do you see a continued balance, or are people going to be jobless? Where do we see this going in future? I know there's no definite answer, but there might be a line of thought to this extent.
I don't think it needs to be a left-right split. I mean, if you think about Karl Marx, right? Marx was not at all opposed to technological innovation and the shifting of the frontier of creativity. What he was concerned about was who owns the means of production and who has access to the fruits of that production. I think certainly it is the case that technological developments create new opportunities and also new problems for society, and Rohan hinted at a lot of those and also addressed them in the question. And insofar as technology makes human labor obsolete, then it does create a classic left-right question. But I think the vast majority of the left has embraced modernity and is thinking about the way in which we use it to the common advantage rather than saying no to it. So that would be my response.
The last question, please, 15.
Afternoon, sir. Sirs. My question, actually I have two. You guys can choose whichever one you want to, since this is the last question. The first one is a serious question. The second one is much lighter. So the first one is, in history, and this is to Mr. Rahul. In history, we learn that in the period of monarchs and kings, culture was propagated by patronizing art and culture. In today's world, we seem to have a more, how do I put this, a greater entertainment quotient than a cultural quotient. And how do you think as a family, as a basic unit of society, can we counter this entertainment quotient and the cultural quotient? This is the serious one. Or the lighter one is, since we are talking about creativity, would either of you like to share some creative moments that you had at Cotton's?
And I think you should answer both questions, both of you.
It's weird. I prepared quite a lot for this lecture, but I didn't prepare for that last question, which was a concrete example. So I think this idea of a split between an entertainment and some kind of high cultural value is not really something I would endorse. I think something can be simultaneously both entertaining and enriching in a way. If by entertainment we limit ourselves to, page 3, then yes, I agree that there is a split. But I think some of the most enduring cultural products have been both entertaining and informative. I'm going to have to think about your second question, and maybe I'll come back to you later. I need some time.
Rahul was a good boy, as you can see.
No, I entirely agree with what Rahul said. I somehow, in most cases, don't necessarily see the dichotomy between the two. For example, the books that Rahul mentioned earlier on, right? I mean, there's these translations. At one point of time, poetry and so on, some of these books were entertainment for people of that time. And today they're sort of classics in knowledge and so on. So I don't, unless you go to the extreme cases that Rahul mentioned, and in my own definition, that's page 3, Bollywood movies and so on, you really, I don't know if there's much to learn there, but otherwise there's so much to learn even through entertainment. Your second one, well, without getting any details, actually Aditya, I was head of day scholars, some such thing, not house captain, there's somebody else as house captain, and there is a story of how I managed to convince and engineer socials when I was in my 12th, and it was not going to happen actually. I don't know if you guys still have it, but I won't get into any of the details. And we eventually had a very fun socials that year in my 12th.
And I think you had a bit of a protest in your graduation as well.
Well,
so that was creative.
We've had several protests in schools.
And I believe our medal winner had a creative moment when he let off an atom bomb in class. But you didn't hear it here. You didn't hear it here. Well, with that we're done. I'll request both of you to stay on stage. You've really had to sing for your supper. And we would like to felicitate you on behalf of the Trust and on behalf of everyone present here. Could I request my friend Belyappa to please come on stage and present both Rahul and Rohan with a token of our appreciation. Thank you, Belyappa, for representing the family and also your batch of Cottonians. And ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for both our speakers.
So Aditya, I took what you said very seriously earlier, and I must follow in the footsteps of my senior Nandan, and I'll double what Nandan has done, and I hope some of you will also contribute.
Thank you, Rohan. You've left me a bit gobsmacked now. And my profuse apologies for downgrading you from head of day scholars to Elphick House captain. Especially if it's Elphick House. I know how that must feel. Thank you, gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, we have just a small formality left. Firstly, to recognize our wonderful patrons, Admiral Shekhawat in absentia, Chief of Naval Staff and a proud Cottonian now in Jaipur. General S.K. Jaitley, who unfailingly is with us every year. And may I request Mrs. Vatsa to please present him with a token from the Trust. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Mrs. Jaitley, for being with us, coming down every year from Delhi. And Air Marshal Osman, a former Vice Chief of the Air Staff, an old boy, couldn't be with us today because of a pressing family commitment. This, friends, has been a very good lecture. We also want to present the Vice Principal with a token of our appreciation. And could I request Mrs. Sudha Murty to please do us the honors? What do you want? No, wait, I'll see. Thank you, ma'am. Yes, of course.
I know Rohan's creativity in school. I told Rohan, you have to read 4 books you have to bring 4 books from the library and read in a week. He said, no problem, and he brought ABCD books.
That was the creative moment you were looking for. Friends, it's been a difficult year in the sense because we've lost many friends along the way. We want to take a moment to remember them. Just a quick moment to say thank you to all of you, every single one of you, for being a patient and an extremely vibrant audience. Extremely well done, boys. I think your questions were brilliant. I wish you would keep the chatter down. Cottonian is a gentleman with no nonsense about him, right? Who said that? Dr. Pope. So no nonsense. But otherwise, excellent turnover. Friends, all of you, Cottonians, civilians, veterans, what a brilliant turnout. Old teachers and masters, especially proud to see you here. Thank you to Team Bishop Cotton, Principal Professor John Zachariah again. The principal of the girls' school, Dr. Lavanya Mitran, for sending her awards. I wish we had a question from you as well. I want to thank, they've thrown you a challenge now, so next year. I want to thank Brigadier Devaya and the MEG for the wonderful band, which turns out unfailingly, and a special thank you to all the donors who've supported our trust. And I take this opportunity, Rohan, to thank you for your spontaneous generosity. It's going to go a long way and it's going to go to the right people. To my fellow trustees, can I please ask you to come forward for a moment? Kiran, Rajiv, Ashwin, Prashant, Lokesh. CN, I know, is on duty. These are the faces you don't see, but who make the show happen. Thank you, gentlemen. Friends, if you've enjoyed this morning or you have a reaction to what you've seen, if you've liked our new format, you think we can further it, fine-tune it, you want to criticize us for what we've gotten wrong, please write in. We're all on email, you know our coordinates, and we very much value your feedback. I believe there are friends who've actually attended all 10 lectures and now all 11 lectures. Would you please stand up? I know Colonel Uthaya is one of them. A round of applause. Yes, that's Prakash. Wonderful. Wonderful. Commodore Saqib. Brilliant. Dad, I think you bunked one. Yes, you had surgery. Yes. But this is the sort of goodwill, friends, and in this list you saw there were as many non-Cottonians as there were Cottonians, and that tells you what the sort of energy of this lecture series is. So we'll keep coming back, but we want to make this more interactive. We don't want to call the shots. So if you have ideas, you have references, you have friends who deserve to be recognized, and very importantly now, friends, tell us about teachers you want recognized, because we have a corpus that has now not just doubled but trebled itself thanks to Rohan. We've started off extremely well, I think, with 4 wonderful people, but we have many more to cover, and I want you to help us unearth them. And we're also trying to go paperless, so if you're not on our e-list, please just drop your card on your way out, and I promise you I will add you to our mailing list. It's been wonderful having you here. Thank you very much. Jai Hind. And let's please stand for a moment to sing the national anthem.
Favorite songs from way back then. Take a ride, let us find an empty land. Let us don't never go away again. the name to that fellas. Don't it never go away. Don't it never go away. Don't it never go away again.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Cottonians have always been in the forefront with music. It's part of our heritage, music, and all sorts of activities. Yeah, he's sniggering at me. Okay, I'm not going to tell you all those other activities. Those are dark secrets. Anyhow, this is a song I wrote in Kashmir when I was a young fighter pilot going for the JNSS course for General Thimayya, great leader. This was I got the idea on the bus going from Jammu to Srinagar. There was a military bus there. I see her face once again in the cool river breeze as it goes across my cheek. I see her face once again in the leaves that are green through the years on the trees. I hear a voice echo back from the valley. She seems to say, come back to me today. Why did you lie when you said that you